I am Aisha Moody, and in my father's eyes, I am nothing more than a failed office worker. I still remember the exact moment my father, Colonel Frank Moody, pointed a finger at my face in the middle of his wedding anniversary party, laughing in front of 50 guests. "Look at her," he boomed, his voice thick with beer and arrogance. "She thinks typing on a computer is protecting the country. Aisha, honey, when are you going to do something actually useful, like your cousin Brett here?" He had no idea that just 12 hours prior, this useless daughter had authorized a kinetic cyberstrike that neutralized a rogue warhead targeting the East Coast. They think I am the weak black sheep. They are wrong. They have no idea what is coming. When that black MH-6 Little Bird helicopter tears through the suburban sky and touches down on the front lawn, my father's arrogant smile is going to vanish forever. Thank you so much for being here with Quiet Power Stories. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, your country and city, in the comments. We'd love to know. Please note that this story includes some fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarities are purely coincidental, but the message is one worth reflecting on. The air in Northern Virginia in late July is heavy, a wet blanket of humidity that clings to your skin the moment you step outside. But today, the humidity was overpowered by the smell of charred pork ribs and cheap lighter fluid. I stood in the far corner of my parents' backyard, my back pressed against the weathering cedar fence, holding a red plastic cup filled with lukewarm lemonade. I wasn't drinking it. It was just a prop, something to keep my hands busy so I wouldn't have to shake hands with people who didn't really want to see me. Across the yard near the oversized stainless steel grill, my father was holding court. Colonel Frank, the Colonel Moody. Even at 68, he commanded the space like he was still patrolling the perimeter in Fallujah. He held a can of Miller Lite in one hand and a pair of tongs in the other, gesturing wildly as he retold the story of the Second Battle of Fallujah for the 100th time. "We didn't wait for permission," Frank roared, the veins in his neck bulging slightly. "We kicked the door in. That's how you handle insurgents. You don't send them an email. You send them a 5.56 round." The crowd of neighbors and family friends laughed and nodded like a congregation of obedient sheep. They loved it. They loved the machismo, the noise, the old-school American grit. I stood there in a floral dress my mother had bought me from Macy's because she said it made me look softer. I felt ridiculous. I felt like I was wearing a costume. Underneath the floral print, my body was a map of scars and muscle, honed by years of training that would break half the men standing around that cooler. But to them, I was just Aisha, the girl who stared at screens. Then the sliding glass door opened and the atmosphere shifted. "There he is," my father bellowed, his voice cracking with genuine delight. "There is the warrior." Brett stepped onto the patio, my 30-year-old cousin. He was wearing his reservist dress uniform. It was perfectly pressed, the creases sharp enough to cut paper. He had just finished his basic training and a few weekends of duty. But the way he walked, you'd think he had just single-handedly taken a beachhead at Normandy. Frank abandoned the grill. He marched over and slapped Brett on the shoulder so hard the kid actually stumbled forward a step. "Look at that uniform," Frank announced to the party, beaming. "That is the Moody bloodline right there. Solid. Real." I watched my father's hand rest on Brett's shoulder. It was a heavy, reassuring weight, a gesture of pride. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. In 38 years, through graduations and promotions, Frank Moody had never touched me like that. Not once. I took a sip of the warm lemonade to wash down the lump in my throat. "So, Aisha," a voice chirped next to me. It was Mr. Henderson from 2 doors down. He was holding a plate piled high with potato salad and baked beans. "I haven't seen you in a while. What are you up to these days? Still working for the government?" I opened my mouth to speak. I was about to give my standard classified safe answer about logistics, but I never got the chance. "She fixes printers at the Pentagon, Bob." Frank had appeared out of nowhere, Brett in tow. He leaned in, winking at Mr. Henderson. "Seriously, someone has to change the toner cartridges so the real generals can print their memos, right?" The circle of guests erupted in laughter. It wasn't mean-spirited laughter, not exactly. It was dismissive. It was the laughter you give a child who draws a picture of a horse that looks like a dog. It's IT support, Dad, I said quietly, my voice barely carrying over the music. Exactly. Frank pointed at me with his beer can. IT support. Have you tried turning it off and on again? Right? He turned back to Brett. Now, Brett here is going to be deployed to a base in Germany next month. Real boots on the ground. Brett grinned, puffing out his chest. Just doing my duty, Uncle Frank. Someone's gotta hold the line. Damn straight, Frank said. I looked at Brett. I looked at the National Defense Service medal pinned to his chest. The participation trophy everyone gets just for signing up during a time of conflict. He wore it like it was a medal of honor. He had no idea what war was. He had no idea what it smelled like, or how it felt when the person next to you stopped breathing. I felt a gentle, trembling hand on my arm. I looked down to see my mother, Martha. She looked tired, her smile strained as she scanned the crowd to make sure everyone had enough napkins. Aisha, she whispered, leaning close so Frank wouldn't hear. Don't look so sour, honey. It upsets your father. I'm not sour, Mom. I'm just listening. Why don't you talk to Brett's friend over there? She gestured vaguely toward the keg. He's a nice boy. A chaotic life isn't good for a woman your age. You need stability. You need a husband like your father. Stop burying your head in those computers and live a little. I almost laughed. A bitter, jagged laugh that wanted to claw its way out of my throat. Stability? She had no idea. None of them did. That computer she despised was currently running a level 5 diagnostic on the Eastern Interconnection. My team at Cyber Command was the only thing standing between the United States and a total blackout that would plunge 40% of the country into chaos. While they ate their ribs and judged my life choices, I was keeping their lights on. I was keeping their hospital ventilators running. I'm fine, Mom, I said, pulling my arm away gently. I'm really fine. You're invisible, Aisha, she sighed, shaking her head before walking away to refill the coleslaw. You make yourself invisible. I turned back to the fence, staring at a knot in the wood. She was right. I was invisible. But what she didn't understand was that in my world, invisibility was a weapon. My eyes drifted back to Brett. The sunlight glinted off that shiny, unearned metal on his chest. It was so bright, so polished. It reminded me of something. It triggered a memory I usually kept locked away in a steel box in my mind. I wasn't looking at Brett anymore. I was looking back 15 years, to a rainy parade deck, and a medal that wasn't shiny at all. One that was stained with mud and memories I could never wash away. I blinked, and the glare from Brett's shiny, unearned medal faded, replaced by the mental image of a different time, a different place. The noise of the barbecue, the sizzling fat, the clinking beer bottles, the mindless laughter, began to sound muffled, like I was hearing it from underwater. I wasn't in Virginia anymore. I was back in the kitchen of our old house in North Carolina, staring at a ghost. My parents never said it out loud, but I grew up in the shadow of the brother I never had. I was the consolation prize. When the doctor announced, "It's a girl," I imagined my father, a captain back then, let out a heavy sigh that deflated the entire room. He wanted a linebacker. He wanted a grunt to carry on the moody name in the Marine Corps. Instead, he got Aisha. Growing up, I lived in a constant state of paradox. It was a rigorous, confusing boot camp of emotion. If I played with dolls, Frank would scoff and say I was too soft for the real world. So I toughened up. I scraped my knees, I learned to shoot a .22 rifle before I learned long division, and I ran track until my lungs burned like fire. But when I came home sweaty and bruised, looking for his approval, he'd wrinkle his nose. "Jesus, Aisha," he'd say, "you're acting like a boy. Tone it down. You'll never find a husband acting like a drill sergeant." I could never win. I was either too weak to be a Moody or too tough to be a daughter. The memory that stings the most, the one that still sits in my gut like a swallowed stone, happened when I was 18. It was a Tuesday. I remember the mailman had just left. I held the thick, cream-colored envelope in my hands, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The return address was embossed in gold. United States Military Academy, West Point, NY. I didn't just get in. I had clawed my way in. Top of my class, varsity athlete, letters of recommendation from 2 senators. I waited for Frank to come home from the base. I set the letter on the center of the dining table, right next to his coaster. When he walked in, smelling of CLP gun oil and starch, I stood at attention, beaming. "Dad, look." He picked up the envelope. He read it. I held my breath, waiting for the hug, waiting for the, "That's my girl." Instead, he tossed it back onto the table. It slid across the wood and fell onto the floor. "Well," he grunted, popping the tab on a soda. "I guess they really are lowering the standards these days." The air left the room. "What?" I whispered. "Quotas, Aisha," he said, not even looking at me. "The army is going soft. They need to fill a certain number of skirts to keep the politicians happy. Don't let it go to your head. You're a diversity hire before you've even put on boots. You'll wash out in the first week of Beast Barracks. Don't embarrass the family name when you quit." He walked away to watch TV. I stood there, picking up the letter from the floor. That night, I didn't cry. I felt something inside me calcify. His doubt became my fuel. Every mile I ran, every exam I aced, every time I wanted to collapse during the 4 years at the point, I heard his voice. "You're just a quota." But I didn't quit, and I didn't stop at West Point. The memories shifted darker, colder. I was 24, Ranger School. Phase 2, Mountains. Most people don't know that women weren't even allowed in Ranger School until recently. When I went through, I was an anomaly, a glitch in the system. The cold in the Georgia mountains that winter was a living, breathing thing that tried to kill us every night. During a night patrol exercise, I slipped on black ice while carrying an 80-pound rucksack. I fell 10 feet into a ravine. I heard the crack before I felt the pain. 2 broken ribs. The pain was blinding, white-hot, jagged edges grinding together every time I took a shallow breath. By regulation, I should have tapped out. I should have fired a flare and gone to the hospital. But I knew what Frank would say. "See? Women are fragile. They break." So I stood up. I duct-taped my torso so tight I could barely expand my lungs. I marched for another 12 days. I climbed ropes, I navigated swamps, and I carried a 200-pound man on my back during casualty drills, all while my own bones were screaming. I earned that Ranger tab. I earned it with blood and calcium. When I came home for Christmas leave that year, I was 10 pounds lighter, hollow-eyed, but wearing the tab. I was one of the few women on Earth to have one. Frank looked at my uniform. He looked at the black and gold arc on my shoulder. "You look thin," was all he said. "You look tired, Aisha. Why do you do this to yourself? Just get a desk job. Be a secretary for a general or something. At least then you'll be safe and out of the way of the real men." He didn't know I had just survived hell. He didn't know I could dismantle him in hand-to-hand combat in under 10 seconds. He just saw a girl playing dress-up. That was the moment I stopped trying to impress him with physical feats. I realized that in his world, a woman with a gun was a novelty, a joke. So I chose a different weapon. I transferred to Cyber Command. Not because I was scared of the front lines, but because the battlefield had changed. The next war wouldn't be fought with tanks in the desert. It would be fought with code in the dark. In the cyber realm, it didn't matter how much you could bench press. It didn't matter if you were a man or a woman. It only mattered if you were smarter. In the digital world, I was a god. But here, in this backyard in Virginia, sipping warm lemonade, I was just the disappointment. I thought about Deborah Sampson. She was a woman in the Revolutionary War who bound her chest and disguised herself as a man named Robert Shirtleff just so she could fight for her country. She took a musket ball to the thigh and dug it out herself with a penknife so no doctor would discover her secret. She bled in silence so she could serve. I am Deborah Sampson. I have dug the bullets out of my own heart for years so I could keep standing here. If you have ever felt like you had to work twice as hard just to get half the respect, or if your family never understood your path, I want you to hit that like button right now. And please leave a comment below with a simple yes if you know exactly how this feels. Let me know I'm not the only one fighting this battle alone. I looked back at my father, who was now handing Brett another cold beer, laughing at some joke about chair force soldiers. Laugh while you can, Dad, I thought, the bitterness finally giving way to a cold, professional resolve. You want a son with a gun? I gave you a daughter who commands the lightning. You just refuse to look up at the sky. And the sky was about to fall on him. Brett was still talking. He was holding up his beer can, reenacting a marksmanship drill at the range. So I'm looking down the sights, he said, spraying a little spit as he spoke. And the sergeant yells, "Fire!" And bam! Center mass, 300 meters, iron sights. The crowd oohed and ah-ed. My father nodded, his chest puffing out as if he had fired the round himself. That's focus, Frank declared. That's what separates the men from the boys. I took a slow sip of my warm lemonade, letting the sugar settle on my tongue. 300 meters, I thought. That's cute. While Brett was bragging about hitting a paper target that wasn't shooting back, my mind drifted 200 miles north, away from this suburban backyard and into the bowels of the Pentagon. I wasn't standing on grass anymore. I was in the tank, the Joint Chiefs of Staff conference room. It's a room with no windows, thick soundproof walls, and gold curtains that hide nothing but steel and concrete. The air in there is always recycled, always cold, smelling of stale coffee and high-grade anxiety. In my mind, it was last Tuesday. The room was filled with full-bird colonels and three-star generals, men with chests full of ribbons and egos to match. The atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. The Secretary of Defense, the SecDef, walked in. Immediately, the room scrambled. Chairs scraped against the floor. Every man in that room shot to his feet, spines rigid, eyes forward, everyone except me. I sat at the head of the tactical console, my fingers hovering over a silent keyboard. I didn't stand. Not because I was disrespectful, but because when you are the mission commander for an active Level 5 cyber operation, you outrank protocol. You are the only thing holding the wall. The Secretary of Defense walked right past the generals, came to my shoulder, and leaned down. "General Moody," he whispered, his voice tight. "What is the status?" He didn't ask Frank. He didn't ask a Marine with big biceps. He asked me. "Status is green, Mr. Secretary," I replied, my eyes never leaving the data stream cascading down my monitor. "Payload delivered. The enemy's grid is neutralized." Back in the yard, Brett was now laughing about how heavy his rucksack was. 80 pounds, man. Felt like a ton of bricks. I suppressed a smirk. Heavy? Try the weight of 40 million lives. My mind flashed to another memory, just 7 days ago. The Florida incident. It hadn't made the news yet. We made sure of that. A rogue state actor, likely working out of a basement in St. Petersburg, had managed to bypass the firewall of a water treatment facility in Oldsmar. They weren't trying to steal credit card numbers. They were trying to increase the levels of sodium hydroxide, lye, in the drinking water from 100 parts per million to 11th use. They were trying to poison an entire city. I was in the SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, at Fort Meade when the alarm tripped. A red light, silent and terrifying, pulsed on the main wall. "Ma'am, they've seized control of the PLC valves," a young lieutenant yelled, panic edging into his voice. "We have 3 minutes before the toxic water hits the main distribution pipes." 3 minutes. That was all the time I had to prevent mass casualty. In the movies, people scream and run around. In reality, in my world, it gets deadly quiet. My heartbeat didn't elevate. My hands didn't shake. I took a sip of my black coffee. "Isolate the subnet," I ordered, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Deploy the Black Ice counter script. Lock 'em out and brick their server." "But ma'am, that's an act of war if we trace it back to—" I said execute, I said softly. "I'll take the heat. Save the city." 30 seconds later, the threat was gone. The valves closed. The hacker's system was fried. I had just saved thousands of families from drinking poison with a few keystrokes, and I did it before my morning coffee got cold. "Speak softly and carry a big stick," Theodore Roosevelt once said. I looked at my father, who was now using his tongs to flip a burger, lecturing a neighbor about how technology makes people soft. Soft. He had no idea that the most dangerous weapon in the United States arsenal wasn't a tank or a missile. It was me. And I was standing 10 feet away from him, wearing a floral dress from Macy's. I glanced over my shoulder at the driveway. Parked behind my dad's oversized Ford F-150 was my car. A sensible 5-year-old gray Honda Accord. It was dusty. There was a dent in the rear bumper. It looked like the car of a mid-level office manager, which was exactly the point. But inside the trunk, hidden beneath a heavy canvas tarp and a box of emergency jumper cables, was a garment bag. Inside that bag was my Army service uniform, the dress blues. On the shoulders were the single silver stars of a brigadier general. It lay there in the dark, pressed and perfect. That uniform was the only proof of who I really was. It was a ghost, haunting the trunk of a Honda. Sometimes late at night, I would drive to an empty parking lot just to open the trunk and look at it, just to remind myself that General Moody existed. That she wasn't a hallucination. Here, I was just Aisha, the girl who couldn't find a husband. The girl who disappointed her father because she didn't carry a rifle in the mud. Aisha? Yoo-hoo, Aisha. The sharp voice snapped me back to reality. The Pentagon vanished. The gold curtains dissolved into cedar fencing. It was my Aunt Sarah. She was wearing a sun hat that was far too large for her head and holding a crumpled piece of paper. Oh, thank goodness I caught you, she said, bustling over. Your dad said you work with computers. You know about the Excel, right? I blinked, adjusting to the sudden shift in altitude. From preventing cyber-nuclear war to this. Yes, Aunt Sarah, I know Excel. Oh, wonderful. She shoved the paper into my hand. It was a list of expenses for the church bake sale, handwritten in scribbly cursive. I'm trying to make the columns add up automatically on my laptop, but every time I press the button, it just makes a beep noise. Can you fix it for me? I need to print it out for the pastor by tomorrow. I looked at the paper. Flour, sugar, sprinkles. Total, $45,150. A minute ago, I was reliving the moment I authorized a counterstrike that could have escalated into World War III. Now, I was being asked to troubleshoot a bake sale budget. I looked at my father. He was watching us, a smirk on his face. See? He called out to the group. She's the family IT support. Got a computer problem? Aisha's your girl. The humiliation wasn't a sharp knife. It was a dull spoon, scooping me out little by little. He reduced my career, my rank, my sacrifice, down to a tech support ticket. I looked at Aunt Sarah. Her eyes were hopeful, innocent. She didn't mean any harm. None of them did. They were just deaf. They were deaf to the silent war raging around them, the war I fought so they could sleep at night. Of course, Aunt Sarah, I said, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. It's probably just a formula error. I'll take a look at it after we eat. You're an angel, she patted my cheek. Such a helpful girl. Helpful. I turned back to the fence, gripping my cup until the plastic crinkled. I am not helpful, I screamed internally. I am lethal. But as I stood there, listening to the cicadas buzz and the laughter of people who thought they were safe because of men like Brett, I realized something terrifying. I preferred the silence of the tank. I preferred the cold pressure of a DEFCON 2 alert. Because in that room, at least I existed. Here, surrounded by my own blood, I was a ghost. And ghosts don't speak until they have to haunt you. Brett's laughter rang out again, a sharp, grating sound that seemed to scratch against the inside of my skull. He was telling another story, something about a prank they played in the barracks involving a raccoon and a sleeping bag. The neighbors slapped their knees. My father wiped a tear of mirth from his eye. I stood there, gripping my cup, and suddenly, the noise of the party faded into a dull hum. I felt a phantom ache in my chest, not from a broken rib, but from a profound, hollow loneliness. I looked at these people who shared my DNA, my last name, and my history, and I realized I didn't know them. And they certainly didn't know me. There is a verse in the Bible, Proverbs 18:24, that says, "There is a friend who sticks closer than a brother." I used to think that was just poetic filler for Sunday sermons. I didn't believe it until I met Major Clayton Vance. My mind drifted away from the smell of charcoal and sunscreen, transporting me to a place that smelled of ozone, gun oil, and cheap break room coffee. I thought of Vance. He is my right hand, my executive officer, and the only man I have ever met who listens more than he speaks. He's a giant of a man, born and bred in Odessa, Texas, with shoulders wide enough to block a doorway and a drawl as thick as molasses. To my father, Vance would look like the ideal soldier. He played football in college, he hunts deer with a bow, and he looks like he was carved out of granite. But unlike Frank, Vance doesn't worship his own reflection. I remembered a day, 3 years ago. We were downrange, deployed in Afghanistan. It was a rare field operation for a cyber officer, but we had to physically secure a server from a compound before the kinetic strike team leveled the building. We were taking fire. The air was filled with the angry hornet buzz of 7.62 rounds. An RPG hit the wall behind us. The concussion wave knocked the wind out of me. Before I could even register the dust choking my lungs, a massive weight slammed into me, pinning me to the ground. It was Vance. He covered my body with his own, using his back as a shield against the raining debris and shrapnel. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think, "She's a woman. She's weak." He thought, "That is my commander, and she is essential to the mission." When the dust settled, he rolled off me, his face streaked with dirt and blood from a gash on his forehead. He didn't ask if I was scared. He offered me a hand up and said, "You good, boss? We gotta drive to Decrypt." "I'm good, Vance," I had said, my voice shaking. "Then let's move," he replied. "I got your six. I got your six. I've got your back." I looked at Brett, who was currently bragging about how he almost got into a fight at a bar last week. Would Brett take shrapnel for me? Would Frank? Or would they just lecture me on how I should have ducked faster? The memory shifted to something softer, something that happened just 24 hours ago. It was in the break room at the secure facility. The fluorescent lights were humming their usual annoying tune. I had walked in, expecting to just grab a stale cup of coffee and get back to monitoring the Russian bot farms. Instead, I found the entire Ares task force standing there. There were no streamers, no balloons. We aren't allowed those in the SIF. But on the center table, sitting on a stack of classified briefing binders, was a sheet cake from Safeway. It was vanilla with white frosting. Written in blue icing were the words, "Congratulations, General." There was a single candle burning. Vance stepped forward, holding a plastic fork. "We know you hate fuss, boss," he said, grinning. "But you don't pin on a star every day. We figured we should pause the cyber war for 5 minutes to eat some sugar." I looked around the room. There was Lieutenant Chung, the brilliant codebreaker who barely spoke English when she was 10, but now wrote scripts that terrified foreign governments. There was Sergeant Miller, a kid from Detroit who could bypass a firewall faster than he could tie his shoes. And there was Vance. They didn't look at me and see a spinster. They didn't see a woman who was aging out of her prime. They didn't see a disappointment. They saw their leader. They saw the person who stayed late to sign their leave forms, who fought for their budget, who took the heat when the brass came down on them. "Make a wish, ma'am," Miller said. I blew out the candle. And then, to my absolute horror, I started to cry. Just a little. A single tear tracked through the powder on my cheek. I quickly wiped it away, but Vance saw it. He didn't say anything. He just cut me the biggest corner piece with the most frosting and handed it to me silently. It was the best cake I had ever tasted. It tasted like respect. Buzz. The vibration against my thigh was violent, snapping me back to the Virginia backyard. My phone. I pulled it out of the hidden pocket of my dress. The screen was bright against the afternoon shade. Caller ID, Major Vance. My heart skipped a beat. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my veins. Vance knew where I was. He knew today was my parents' anniversary. He knew I was off the grid for family time. We had a strict protocol. You do not call the general during personal time unless the world is ending. If Vance was calling, the world might actually be ending. My thumb hovered over the green button. I wanted to answer it. God, I wanted to answer it. I wanted to hear his deep, calm voice telling me the situation, asking for orders. I wanted to step back into my skin, into the role where I mattered. Who's blowing up your phone? I jumped. Frank was standing right behind me, peering over my shoulder. He smelled of beer and judgment. Is it a boyfriend? He asked, his tone mocking. Finally found some poor sap to take you on a date? I quickly hit the power button, silencing the call and shoving the phone back into my pocket. No, Dad, it's just work. Work? He scoffed, turning back to the group. See? She can't even disconnect for a party. Probably a paper jam at the office. Brett laughed. Or maybe she needs to update Adobe Reader. I felt the phone vibrate again. A voicemail. I looked at my father, then at Brett, and then down at my hands. They were trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from a rage so hot it felt cold. I looked at Frank's hand resting on Brett's shoulder, that heavy paw of approval. And in that moment, the truth hit me with the force of a kinetic strike. I didn't want his approval anymore. I didn't want to be part of this moody bloodline if it meant being blind and arrogant. I thought of Vance, probably sitting in the dark glow of the monitors, waiting for my command, trusting me to make the right call to save millions of lives. I would rather be in a concrete bunker with Vance, I thought, the realization settling in my bones like lead. I would rather be staring down a nuclear countdown with my team than eating this potato salad and listening to these lies. They were my blood, yes. But Vance, Chang, Miller, they were my people. I checked my phone surreptitiously one more time. A text message had come through from Vance. It was just 2 characters. 911, it wasn't a joke, it wasn't a drill. I looked up at the blue summer sky, which suddenly seemed very fragile. Something was coming. And the people laughing around this grill had no idea that the only person who could stop it was the daughter they were busy ignoring. Aisha, my mother called out, come help me bring out the corn. Coming, Mom, I said. I walked toward the house, but my hand stayed on my phone, clutching it like a grenade with the pin pulled out. Clink, clink, clink. The sound of metal striking glass cut through the humid afternoon air, silencing the murmur of 50 conversations. It was the universal signal for, pay attention to me. My hand was still inside the pocket of my dress, fingers wrapped tightly around my phone. The screen was dark, but the 2 digits from Vance's text message, 911, were burned into my retina. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a war drum warning of an incoming attack. But the attack wasn't coming from a foreign server or a satellite uplink. It was standing right in front of me, holding a half-empty bottle of Miller Lite. Folks, everyone, quiet down for a second, Frank roared, his face flushed a deep, satisfied red. He stood on the patio step, elevating himself just enough to look down on the rest of us. I want to propose a toast. The guests shuffled forward, forming a loose semicircle. I tried to step back, to fade into the shadows of the oversized oak tree, but the crowd pressed in, trapping me. Frank draped his heavy arm around Brett's shoulders again. Brett beamed, standing at a rigid position of attention that looked more like a parody than a posture. To this young man right here, Frank bellowed, raising his bottle. My nephew, Brett. He just finished his basic combat training. He dragged his ass through the mud, he slept in the dirt, and he learned how to shoot straight. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the Moody bloodline in action. Hoo-ah! Someone shouted from the back, probably Mr. Henderson, who had never served a day in his life but watched too many movies. Damn straight, hoo-ah! Frank echoed. In a world full of snowflakes and people who want safe spaces, Brett stepped up to be the tip of the spear. He's the real deal. A warrior. I looked at Brett's boots. They were pristine, not a scuff. The tip of the spear had never even opened an MRE, meal, ready to eat, in a combat zone. But I kept my face blank. Discipline, I told myself. Maintain cover. Then the spotlight shifted. Frank's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on me. The pride in his face instantly evaporated, replaced by a look of performative pity. It was the look you give a three-legged dog. And then, Frank said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming theatrically soft, "We have my daughter, Aisha." Every head turned. 50 pairs of eyes bored into me. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a simmering, volcanic anger. "Now, don't get me wrong," Frank continued, gesturing at me with his beer bottle as if conducting an orchestra of humiliation. "Aisha works for the Department of Defense, too. She drives up to DC every day, sits in a nice air-conditioned cubicle, and, well, she pushes paper." A ripple of chuckles moved through the crowd. "But hey," Frank laughed, louder now. "The Army needs secretaries too, right? Someone has to file the reports and make sure the coffee pot is full so the real men can do the heavy lifting." The laughter grew. It wasn't malicious from the neighbors. They didn't know better. They just followed Frank's lead. But from Frank, it was surgical. He knew exactly where to cut. "She's what we call a warm body," Frank said, using a term that made my stomach churn. "Some people are born to fight. Some are just born to keep the seat warm until the shift creates over. Right, Aisha?" Warm body. The term echoed in my head. In the military, a warm body is a useless soldier, someone you just plug into a slot to meet a quota. Someone whose only contribution is their pulse. He was calling me a waste of oxygen. I stood there, the woman who had personally designed the encryption keys for the nuclear triad, the woman who had stared down Russian oligarchs and Chinese hackers, being reduced to a seat filler. I wanted to scream. I wanted to reach into my pocket, pull out my badge, and shove it in his face. I wanted to tell him that while he was playing soldier in his backyard, I was fighting a war so complex his brain would short-circuit just trying to understand the rules. But I couldn't. "Actually, Uncle Frank," Brett piped up. The fresh-faced reservist stepped forward, emboldened by the crowd's approval. He looked at me with a smirk that was equal parts arrogance and ignorance. "Chairs break too, you know," Brett joked, winking at a girl near the cooler. He turned to me. "Hey, cuz, tell you what. If the Wi-Fi goes down at the base, or if a printer jams, I'll call you, okay?" The crowd roared. Brett took a step closer to me, invading my personal space. He smelled of cheap cologne and unearned confidence. "But," he whispered loudly enough for the front row to hear, "if the terrorists show up, you call me. I'll handle the scary stuff." My hand, still gripping the plastic lemonade cup, spasmed. Crinkle snap. The red plastic buckled under the pressure of my grip. Lemonade spilled over my fingers, sticky and cold. Time seemed to slow down. I looked at Brett's throat. I calculated the exact amount of pressure it would take to collapse his trachea. 1.5 seconds to strike. 3 seconds to incapacitate. It was a reflex, a predator looking at prey. "Stop," I ordered myself. "Stand down, General." I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of charcoal and betrayal. I uncurled my fingers, letting the crushed cup drip onto the grass. I looked Brett dead in the eye. For a split second, I let the mask slip. I let him see the predator. Brett's smile faltered. He blinked, confused by the sudden coldness in my gaze. He took a half step back, though he probably didn't know why. "That's very brave of you, Brett," I said. My voice was low, steady, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice I used when authorizing a kinetic strike. "I'm sure you'll make the file clerks very proud." It was a subtle jab, one that went right over his head. "Yeah, well," Brett stammered, recovering his bravado. "Someone has to be the hero." "Congratulations, Brett," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Enjoy the party." I turned to walk away. I needed air. I needed to check the 911 text. I needed to get away from these people before I did something that would ruin my security clearance. But I didn't make it 2 steps. A hand clamped down on my upper arm. Hard. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a grip meant to control. I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed, "Threat." But I knew that grip. I looked down. It was Frank. His fingers dug into my bicep, pulling me back, not letting me escape. The jovial smile was gone from his face, replaced by a look of simmering annoyance. "Where do you think you're going?" he hissed, low enough so the guests wouldn't hear, but loud enough to freeze my blood. "I'm not done talking to you." The crowd had turned back to their drinks and their gossip, leaving us in a bubble of tension near the grill. "Let go of my arm, Dad," I said, my voice calm but dangerous. "Don't you walk away when I'm celebrating family," he spat, his breath hot with beer. "You always do this. You sulk. You get jealous because Brett is actually achieving something." "Jealous?" I almost laughed. "Is that what you think this is?" "I think you need a reality check, Aisha," he said, tightening his grip. He began to drag me toward the side of the house, away from the ears of the guests. "We need to have a little talk. Man to whatever you are." I let him pull me. Not because I was weak, but because I knew this was it. This was the cliff edge. He wanted to talk? Fine. He was about to get a briefing. The air on the side of the house was stagnant, trapped between the vinyl siding and the overgrown azalea bushes my mother kept meaning to trim. The roar of the party was muffled here, replaced by the aggressive, mechanical hum of the central air conditioning unit fan spinning violently to combat the Virginia heat. Frank released my arm. He didn't shove me, but he let go with a kind of dismissal, as if he were dropping a bag of trash he was tired of carrying. He leaned back against the beige siding, taking a long pull from his Miller Lite, his eyes scanning me with a mixture of disappointment and fatigue. For a split second, a foolish, childish part of me sparked to life. "Maybe he's going to apologize," it whispered. "Maybe he realized he went too far in front of the neighbors. Maybe he actually wants to know how I am." I was an idiot. "Look, Aisha," Frank started, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I know why you're acting like this. I know why you tried to crush that cup and why you're giving Brett the death stare." I rubbed my arm where his fingers had dug in. "Do you?" "It's jealousy," he stated, as if it were a fact as undeniable as gravity. "And honestly, I don't blame you. It's hard seeing your younger cousin succeed where you stalled out." "Stalled out?" The words left my mouth in a whisper. "Don't give me that look," he sighed, his voice taking on a patronizing, fatherly tone that was infinitely worse than his shouting. "I'm just speaking the truth because I'm your father. You're 38, Aisha. You're single. You live in a small apartment, you drive a beat-up Honda, and you push papers for the government." He took another sip of beer, gesturing vaguely with the bottle. "You tried the soldier thing. You went to West Point. You did the ranger school thing. But let's be honest, honey. You never had the killer instinct. You were never built for the real work, and that's okay." I felt a coldness spreading through my chest, freezing the blood in my veins. It was the same cold focus I felt when I was tracking a threat vector, but this time, the threat was my own father. "So," he continued, "I think it's time you stop pretending. Quit the Pentagon. Find a nice man, maybe a contractor or a logistics guy. Settle down. Have some kids before your eggs dry up completely. Stop wasting your life sitting in a chair that doesn't matter." He looked at me, waiting for me to agree. Waiting for me to break down and thank him for his wisdom. "Doesn't matter," I repeated, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor that had been there 10 minutes ago. "You think my seat at the Pentagon is useless?" Frank laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Aisha, wake up. You're a budget line item. You're a warm body they keep around to satisfy HR diversity requirements. You're eating up taxpayer dollars, my tax dollars, to sit in air conditioning and play on a computer while men like Brett are out there preparing to bleed for this country. Leech, waste, useless." The words hit me like physical blows, but I didn't flinch. Instead, time seemed to stop. The whirring of the AC unit faded into a high-pitched ring. He talked about sacrifice. He talked about bleeding. He didn't know. He didn't know about the mission last November. Operation Silent Night. We weren't behind desks that time. We were on the ground in a former Soviet bloc state, securing a rogue server that contained the launch codes for a dirty bomb. The server was housed in a basement that was leaking radiation like a sieve. The Geiger counters were screaming. The containment shielding had failed. My team hesitated. They had families. They had kids waiting at home. I didn't have anyone waiting. Just a father who thought I was a secretary. So I went in. I went into the hot zone alone. I manually extracted the hard drive. I was in there for 12 minutes. 12 minutes of exposure to levels of radiation that rewrite your DNA. I saved the mission. I secured the codes. But 2 months later, in a sterile white office at Walter Reed Medical Center, a doctor with kind eyes told me the truth. "I'm sorry, General," he had said gently. "The radiation damage to your reproductive system is total. There are no viable eggs left. You will never carry a child." I had sat in my car in the parking lot for an hour, staring at the steering wheel. I had mourned the children I would never have. I had mourned the family I sacrificed to keep his family safe. I gave up my future so Frank could stand here in his backyard, drink his cheap beer, and insult me. He wanted grandkids. I gave them up for his country. He wanted a warrior. I took the radiation burn so his real men didn't have to. And now, he was standing there, calling me a leech. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of a bridge collapsing under too much weight. The tether that bound me to his approval, the desperate need for his love that had driven me for 38 years, it didn't just break. It evaporated. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the broken veins in his nose. I saw the insecurity masked as arrogance. I saw a small, sad man who was terrified of a changing world he no longer understood. If you have ever sacrificed something precious in silence, only to have it thrown back in your face by the people you did it for, I need you to hit that like button right now. And please leave a comment below with the word respect. Because if they won't give it to us, we will give it to each other. I stepped forward. I invaded his personal space. I stood so close I could smell the onions on his breath. For the first time in my life, I didn't slouch to make myself look smaller. I stood at my full height, shoulders squared, chin up. "Dad," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a texture like grinding gravel. He blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in my posture. "What?" "I want you to listen to me very carefully," I said, locking eyes with him. "Because I am never going to repeat this." "Don't you take that tone with me, young lady," he started, his finger coming up to point at my face again. I slapped his hand away. Fast. A sharp, stinging slap that left his hand hanging in the air. His jaw dropped. He looked at his hand, then at me, in total shock. "You call me useless," I hissed, my voice dropping to a register that was pure, cold steel. "You call me a waste of space. You think Brett is a hero because he wears a costume you recognize, but you are blind, old man. You are so tragically blind." "Aisha, I'm warning you." "No," I cut him off. "I am warning you. Enjoy this moment, Frank. Enjoy your beer. Enjoy your little speech about the Moody bloodline, because very soon, the world is going to show you exactly who I am. And when that happens, when you realize what I actually do, you are going to choke on every single word you just said." "Is that a threat?" he sputtered, his face turning purple. "It's a promise," I whispered. I turned my back on him. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't care about his response. I walked away, back toward the patio, back toward the noise of the party. I had taken 3 steps when it happened. Buzz, 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 buzz. The phone in the hidden pocket of my dress vibrated against my hip. It wasn't a text. It wasn't a call. It was a haptic code. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short, the Delta signal. The world slowed down. The birds seemed to stop singing. The wind died. That signal meant one thing. The threat wasn't coming. It was here. The 911 text from Vance hadn't been a warning. It had been a countdown, and the clock just hit 0. The vibration against my hip wasn't a notification. It was a heartbeat. Zip, 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 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. I stopped dead in my tracks. My feet, clad in sensible flats, felt rooted to the manicured fescue grass. The anger I'd felt toward my father 10 seconds ago evaporated, replaced instantly by a sensation that was colder, sharper, and infinitely more familiar. adrenaline. In the civilian world, a vibrating phone usually means a text from a friend, a spam call about your car warranty, or a reminder to pick up milk. But on the device tucked inside the hidden lining of my dress, a device that didn't exist on any commercial registry, that pattern meant only one thing: code Delta. It was the signal every cyber command officer dreads. It meant the firewall had breached. It meant the invisible shield we hold over the erratic, pulsing heart of the American infrastructure had shattered. I didn't turn back to look at Frank. I didn't care about his bruised ego or his half-finished beer. My eyes scanned the perimeter of the yard, my brain automatically shifting gears from daughter to general. One Mississippi. The country music blasting from the Bluetooth speaker on the patio, some song about pickup trucks and dirt roads, cut out mid-chorus. Two Mississippi. The string of festive Edison lights that my mother had draped lovingly over the pergola flickered once, twice, and then died. Three Mississippi. The aggressive hum of the air conditioning unit on the side of the house, the one that had drowned out our argument moments ago, groaned and spun down into a sickening silence. Then, the world went black. It wasn't just our house. I watched as the streetlights beyond the fence winked out in a domino effect, plunging the entire Northern Virginia suburb into a heavy, unnatural twilight. The ambient hum of suburbia, the pool pumps, the distant traffic signals, the electric buzz of life, vanished. Silence crashed down on the backyard like a physical weight. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The 50 guests stood like statues in the dimming light, holding their drinks, confused. Then the murmurs started. "Hey, who kicked the plug?" Someone joked nervously near the cooler. "Is it a brownout?" Aunt Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It's awful hot for the power to go out." My father, ever the man of action in his own mind, sighed loudly. "Damn it, Martha," he yelled toward the kitchen door. "I told you not to run the blender and the oven at the same time. You blew the main breaker again." He marched toward the sliding glass door, shaking his head. "All right, everyone, relax. Just a fuse. I'll go reset it." "Brett, grab a flashlight from my truck." "On it, Uncle Frank," Brett said, eager to be useful. He pulled his smartphone out of his pocket to turn on the torch function. I watched him. I watched the color drain from his face in the pale glow of his screen. "What the hell?" Brett muttered, tapping his screen furiously. "Uncle Frank?" "What?" Frank barked, fumbling with the screen door handle. "My phone," Brett said, his voice pitching up a little. "It's in SOS mode. I have 0 bars. The 5G is completely dead." "Mine too," a neighbor shouted. "I can't load Twitter. Nothing." "I can't make a call," another voice chimed in, panic starting to lace the edges of the crowd. "It says network unavailable." Frank stopped. He looked at the dark house, then at the dark streetlights, then at the useless rectangles of glass glowing in everyone's hands. "It's just a cell tower outage," Frank stated, though he sounded less convinced. "Probably a storm knocked out a transformer down the road." Everyone calmed down. They were sheep. Blind, deaf sheep standing on the edge of a cliff, arguing about the weather. I didn't panic. I didn't check my personal iPhone. I knew it was a brick. I reached into my clutch. My fingers brushed past my lipstick and found the cold, rubberized grip of the secure satellite phone. It was an Iridium Extreme 9575, military spec. It was ugly, bulky, and possessed an antenna as thick as a thumb. To a civilian, it looked like a relic from 1999. To me, it was the only lifeline left. I stepped into the shadow of the oak tree, away from the prying eyes of the guests. I extended the antenna. The screen didn't show a cute wallpaper or a clock. It glowed a harsh, emergency crimson. Priority: flash override. Status: skyline compromised grid. Integrity: 0% order, immediate extraction. I stared at the words. Skyline compromised. Skyline was the classified operational code for the Eastern Interconnection, the power grid that supplied electricity to everything from New York to Florida. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't a blown fuse. Someone had executed a 0-day exploit. They hadn't just turned the lights off. They had fried the control systems. This wasn't an inconvenience. This was the opening move of a war. Aisha, I turned. Frank was looking at me across the yard, squinting in the gloom. He held a flashlight that was flickering weakly. Stop playing on your phone and come hold this light for me while I check the breaker box, he ordered. Brett is trying to get a signal to check the weather radar. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had just told me I was useless. He was standing there with a $10 flashlight, thinking he could fix a nation-state cyber attack with a screwdriver. I didn't move. I didn't answer. Aisha, did you hear me? He shouted, his patience fraying. The breaker box won't help you, Frank, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden silence of the neighborhood, it carried with crystal clarity. Excuse me? He stepped toward me, aggressive. The grid is gone, I said, looking down at the red screen of my sat phone. The cell towers are dead. The internet is dead. This isn't a fuse. Don't be dramatic, he scoffed. It's a power outage. It happens. No, I said, lifting my head. It doesn't happen like this. I heard it before they did. At first, it was just a thrumming vibration in the soles of my feet. Then, a low, whoomp, whoomp, whoomp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The guests stopped talking. They looked up. The sound grew louder, transforming from a vibration into a roar. It was a distinctive, aggressive percussion, the sound of rotors slicing through heavy air. Is that thunder? Aunt Sarah asked. No, Brett whispered, his eyes widening. That's a chopper, a low one. The sound tore through the quiet suburb, shaking the windows in their frames. It wasn't a news helicopter. It wasn't a medical evac. It was the angry, mechanical scream of a tactical bird flying purely on instruments in a blackout. My father looked up, confusion etched into every line of his face. Why is a helicopter flying this low over a residential zone? That's against FAA regulations. I looked at the text on my screen one last time. ETA, 10 seconds. LZ, marked. I dropped the bulky phone back into my bag and snapped it shut. I smoothed the skirt of my floral dress. They aren't following FAA regulations, Dad, I said, my voice cutting through the rising roar of the approaching engine. Frank spun around to look at me. How do you know? Who is they? The trees at the edge of the property began to whip violently. Leaves and twigs rained down on the potato salad. The wind picked up, swirling the napkins into miniature tornadoes. They're here for me, I said. And then, the black shape crested the roof of the house. The world didn't just get loud, it got violent. 1 second, I was standing in a quiet Virginia backyard, smelling charcoal and resentment. The next, the sky collapsed on top of us. The black helicopter, an MH-6 Little Bird, the kind used by the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, didn't just fly over the house. It dropped from the heavens like a stone, arresting its descent at the last possible millisecond with a terrifying, physics-defying flared landing. It hovered 15 feet above the manicured fescue, its skid landing gear just clearing the top of the oak tree. The result was immediate devastation. The downwash from the rotors hit the backyard with the force of a Category 5 hurricane. Get down! Get down! Someone screamed. I think it was Mr. Henderson. But his voice was instantly swallowed by the deafening thwack, 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 thwack of the blades slicing the humid air. The artificial storm tore through the party. The folding table, laden with 3 hours' worth of potato salad, coleslaw, and ribs, flipped over as if kicked by an invisible giant. Red Solo cups took flight like confused birds, spraying beer and lemonade across the yard. Paper plates, napkins, and plastic forks became shrapnel, swirling in a chaotic vortex of debris. Aunt Sarah screamed as her oversized sun hat was ripped from her head, tumbling away into the neighbor's fence. The string of Edison lights tore loose from the pergola, sparking briefly before whipping through the air like a lash. My mother dropped to her knees, covering her head with her hands, burying her face in the grass. And Brett, the warrior, the tip of the spear, I watched him. While the elderly neighbors were hitting the dirt, Brett, the man who had just bragged about hunting terrorists, scrambled backward on his hands and knees. He didn't look for a weapon, He didn't look to protect his aunt. He dove behind the beige wicker outdoor sofa, curling into a fetal ball, his hands clamped over his ears, his face drained of every drop of blood. He looked like a terrified child hiding from a thunderstorm. I didn't move. I stood in the center of the chaos, my hair whipping violently around my face, the skirt of my dress snapping like a flag in a gale. The rotor wash pushed against me, a heavy hot hand trying to force me down, but I locked my knees. I narrowed my eyes against the dust and the smell of JP-8 jet fuel that now saturated the air. This was the smell of my office. This was the smell of power. From the side of the helicopter, ropes didn't drop. They didn't need them. The pilot, a surgical artist with a stick, brought the bird down until the skids were hovering just inches above the ruined remains of the buffet table. 3 figures materialized from the open benches of the little bird. They moved with a fluidity that was almost inhuman. They didn't jump. They flowed onto the grass. They were dressed in full tactical kit, Cry precision combat uniforms in multicom black, designed for psychological intimidation as much as camouflage. Their faces were hidden behind ballistic mandibles and dark eye protection. On their helmets were the 4-tube nightmares known as GPNVG-18 panoramic night vision goggles, flipped up for now, looking like the eyes of a giant spider. They carried short-barreled carbines, HK-416s, suppressed, equipped with laser-aiming modules and optics that cost more than my father's truck. They held them at the low ready position, fingers indexed along the receiver, not the trigger. Discipline, lethal discipline. There were no patches on their shoulders, no names, no flags. These men didn't exist on any roster. They were Tier 1 operators, Delta Force, or perhaps a specialized extraction unit from JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, the kind of men who only show up when the president is sweating. The helicopter immediately pulled up, banking hard to hold a perimeter hover above the neighborhood, its noise still a deafening blanket over the scene. Frank Moody scrambled to his feet. My father, shaken but running on decades of Marine Corps instinct and a bruised ego, decided this was the moment to assert his dominance. He adjusted his polo shirt, which was flapping in the wind, and marched toward the 3 black-clad figures. To him, this was his property, his lawn, his kingdom. "Hey!" Frank shouted, his voice straining against the roar of the rotors. He waved his arms, trying to flag them down like he was yelling at a delivery driver who had parked on the grass. What the hell is the meaning of this? The lead operator, a man whose sheer size made his tactical vest look like a child's bib, didn't even turn his head. He was scanning the yard, his head moving on a swivel, checking sectors. Frank stepped directly into the operator's path. "I am talking to you, son. I am Colonel Frank Moody, United States Marine Corps, retired. You are conducting an unauthorized landing in a residential zone. Identify your commanding officer immediately." Frank thought this was a mistake. He thought they were lost. He thought his rank, a rank he retired with 10 years ago, still held weight in this world. He puffed out his chest, waiting for the young soldier to snap to attention and apologize. It was a pathetic sight. A man living in the past trying to stop a force from the future. The lead operator didn't stop. He didn't salute. He didn't apologize. He simply kept walking. When Frank didn't move, the operator didn't break stride. He extended one arm, stiff and unyielding as an iron bar, and brushed my father aside. It wasn't a violent shove. It was the way you move a curtain. Frank stumbled sideways, his boots slipping on a patch of spilled potato salad. He flailed, barely keeping his balance, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. He had just been physically disregarded by a subordinate. In his world, that was impossible. "I said identify yourself," Frank sputtered, turning to grab the man's shoulder. The second operator, trailing behind, turned his head slightly. The black visor stared at Frank. He raised a gloved hand, palm out, a universal signal to stop. And the menace radiating from that simple gesture froze my father in his tracks. The team continued their advance. They were moving toward the patio, toward the wicker sofa. Brett, peeking out from behind the cushions, saw them coming. His eyes went wide. "Don't shoot," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I'm a reservist. I'm on your side. I'm friendly." He threw his hands up, trembling so hard his marksman badge vibrated on his chest. The lead operator looked down at Brett. Even behind the dark glasses, I could feel the sneer. He didn't speak. He simply reached out with his boot and kicked Brett's leg out of the path, clearing the obstacle. Brett yelped and scrambled further into the bushes, burying his face in the dirt. The warrior had been dismissed like a piece of refuse. And then, there was nothing between the operators and me. I stood by the fence. I hadn't moved an inch. I hadn't covered my head. I hadn't screamed. I still held my crushed plastic cup in one hand and my clutch in the other. The wind whipped my hair across my face, but I didn't brush it away. I watched the lead operator close the distance. 5 meters, 3 meters, 1 meter. He stopped directly in front of me. He was tall, towering over me, a wall of ceramic plating, Kevlar, and high-tech weaponry. He smelled of sweat, gun oil, and the high-altitude chill of the upper atmosphere. The chaos of the yard seemed to pause. My mother, peering through her fingers. My father, panting and red-faced. Brett, sobbing quietly in the bushes. The neighbors, frozen in terror. They all watched. They expected him to arrest me. They expected him to yell at me to get down. They expected me to be the victim. The lead operator reached up and unclipped his ballistic mask. It hissed as the seal broke. He pulled it down, revealing a face hardened by 1,000 night raids, with a scar running through his stubble. It was Major Vance. He didn't look at the party guests. He didn't look at the mess. He looked only at me. His eyes were serious, focused, and filled with an urgency that chilled my blood. The wind howled around us, but in that small circle of space between commander and subordinate, it was perfectly silent. Frank stepped forward again, his voice wavering now, uncertain. Aisha, do you know these men? I didn't answer him. I didn't even look at him. My eyes were locked on Vance. Vance took a breath, squared his shoulders, and did the one thing no one in that backyard had ever done to me. He snapped his heels together. The sound was sharp, crisp, and authoritative. He brought his right hand up in a razor-sharp salute, his fingertips touching the brim of his helmet perfectly. General Moody, Vance barked, his voice cutting through the roar of the helicopter like a thunderclap. We are green on extraction. The football is secure. We are awaiting your orders. The words hung in the air, heavier than the humidity, louder than the screaming turbine engine above us. General Moody, Major Vance didn't whisper it. He didn't say it with a wink or a nudge. He barked it with the full, diaphragm-supported projection of a field commander addressing his superior on a live battlefield. It was a statement of fact, absolute and non-negotiable. I watched my father's face. For 68 years, Frank Moody had built his entire identity around a hierarchy. In his world, there were wolves and there were sheep. There were men who held guns and there were women who held babies. He was the colonel. I was the secretary. That was the architecture of his universe. And in 1 second, Major Vance had taken a sledgehammer to the foundation of that universe. Frank's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish pulled suddenly from the water, gasping for oxygen that wasn't there. His eyes darted from Vance's blacked-out visor to my face, then back to Vance, desperate to find the punchline. Desperate to find the hidden camera crew. Splat. The half-empty bottle of Miller Lite slipped from Frank's limp fingers. It hit the grass with a dull thud, foaming over his pristine white New Balance sneakers. He didn't even notice. General, Frank stammered. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, like he was trying to speak a language he hadn't studied in 50 years. Aisha. What? What is this? He looked at me with a mixture of horror and confusion, as if I had just peeled off a human mask to reveal a cyborg underneath. I didn't answer him. I didn't have time to explain my life story to a man who had spent 3 decades refusing to read the book. The second operator, a shadow named Lieutenant Bishop, stepped forward. He carried a heavy, reinforced Pelican case handcuffed to his wrist. The football. Not the nuclear one the president carries, but the cyber-kinetic command node. It contained the encryption keys to shut down, or blow up, every digital dam, power plant, and server farm in the Northern Hemisphere. Bishop knelt on one knee in the grass, presenting the case like an offering to a queen. He popped the latches. Snap, snap. The lid hissed open. The interior glowed with the blue light of a biometric scanner and a satellite uplink terminal. "Ma'am," Bishop shouted over the rotor wash, "we are connected to the grid. We need biometric authentication to release the blackout countermeasures. The Russians are pushing hard on the firewall." I stepped past my father. I didn't walk like the daughter who apologized for taking up space. I walked like a woman who owned the ground she stood on. I placed my right hand onto the glass scanner. "Scanning," a synthesized female voice announced from the case, loud enough for the front row of the stunned party guests to hear. A green laser swept across my palm. Identity confirmed. Brigadier General Aisha Moody. Commander, Joint Task Force Ares. Clearance level, Yankee White. The mechanical voice echoed through the backyard. "Brigadier General, 1 star." A collective gasp went through the crowd. I heard Aunt Sarah shriek, "A general? A real general?" I looked at the screen. The threat map was bleeding red. I tapped the sequence of commands I had memorized years ago. Authorization code, Alpha Sierra Niner. I spoke into the terminal, my voice steady, flat, lethal. Execute protocol ironclad. Fry them. "Copy that, General," Bishop said, typing furiously. "Payload sent, target neutralized. The grid is stabilizing." I exhaled. The adrenaline that had spiked in my blood began to settle into a cold, hard rock in my stomach. I had just saved the eastern seaboard from a catastrophic infrastructure collapse while standing in my parents' backyard in a floral dress. I stood up. "Secure the package, Lieutenant. We are leaving." "Yes, ma'am." I turned toward the helicopter, but there was an obstacle in my path. Frank. He was standing directly between me and the extraction point. He was trembling. His face had gone from red to a pale, sickly gray. He looked at the star on the screen of the Pelican case, then up at me. He looked at Brett, who was still cowering in the bushes, weeping into his hands. And then he looked at me again. He saw it. Finally, after 38 years, he saw it. He saw the posture. He saw the coldness in the eyes. He saw the predator he had always wanted a son to be, staring back at him from the daughter he had dismissed. "Aisha," he whispered, his voice broken. You outrank me." It wasn't a question, it was a mathematical realization. He was a retired colonel. 06. I was an active duty brigadier general. 07. In the military, that math is absolute. "You are obstructing the extraction zone," I said. My voice wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was professional. "Colonel Moody." He flinched at the use of his rank. "Step aside," I ordered. He didn't move fast enough. He seemed paralyzed by the collapse of his ego. I narrowed my eyes. I drew myself up to my full height. I didn't see my father anymore. I saw a subordinate who was failing to render customs and courtesies. "Colonel Frank Moody," I barked, the command tearing from my throat with the force of a drill sergeant. "Attention!" The reaction was instinctual. It was buried deep in his brainstem, forged by Paris Island and decades of service. You hear that tone, you react. You don't think. You obey. Frank's spine snapped straight, his heels clicked together, his stomach sucked in, his chin tucked. He stood rigid, a statue of discipline, even as his eyes swam with tears of shock. "Hands salute," I ordered. Slowly, agonizingly, Frank raised his right hand. It wasn't the crisp, arrogant salute he used to give his buddies at the VFW. His hand was shaking. His fingers trembled as they touched the brim of his Marine Corps retired baseball cap. He looked at me, really looked at me. And I saw it crumble. The sexism, the dismissal, the warm body comments, the paper pusher insults. They all turned to ash in the face of the silver star that wasn't on my shoulder, but was undeniable in my presence. He was saluting me, not as his daughter, but as his superior. I stood there, the wind whipping my dress around my legs. I let him hold it. 1 second. For the letter from West Point, he ignored. 2 seconds. For the broken ribs, he mocked. 3 seconds. For the useless comment he made 10 minutes ago. It was the longest 3 seconds of his life. It was a funeral for his pride and a coronation for my reality. I slowly raised my hand. My salute was perfect, sharp, razor-edged. The salute of a woman who had earned every millimeter of that respect in the dark, alone, while he slept safely under the blanket of freedom I stitched for him. "As you were, Colonel," I said softly, cutting the salute. Frank dropped his hand. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. He stepped aside, stumbling slightly, clearing the path to the chopper. "Board the bird," Vance shouted, grabbing my arm to guide me. I walked past Frank. I didn't look back. I didn't say "I love you" or "goodbye." I walked toward the roaring machine, leaving the Colonel standing in the ruins of his potato salad, staring at the back of the daughter he never knew he had. The skid of the MH6 Little Bird lifted off the grass, and for a split second, my stomach dropped. A sensation of weightlessness that had nothing to do with gravity and everything to do with liberation. I stepped onto the running board, the wind whipping my hair into a frenzy. Major Vance grabbed my harness, securing me to the bench with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He handed me a headset. I slid it over my ears, and the deafening roar of the rotors was instantly replaced by the dull, rhythmic hum of the intercom and the crackle of tactical chatter. "Package secure," Vance's voice came through, calm and metallic. "We are wheels up. RTB to Andrews." I didn't look at the horizon. I looked down. As the helicopter banked hard to the left, climbing steeply into the Virginia sky, I watched my parents' backyard shrink. The overturned table, the scattered red cups, the trampled fence, it all grew smaller. And the people? I saw Frank. From 500 feet up, he wasn't the towering colossus who had dominated my childhood. He wasn't the colonel whose voice made the walls shake. He was just a speck. A tiny, insignificant figure standing in a patch of ruined grass, staring up at a sky he couldn't reach. Beside him, Brett was nothing more than a dot, and my mother was a shadow. For 38 years, I had lived in that backyard. I had convinced myself that their approval was the entire world. I had swum in their small, stagnant pond, thinking it was the ocean. But as the helicopter tore through the clouds, leaving the suburbs far behind, I realized the truth. The pond was never the world. It was just a puddle. And I had outgrown it a long time ago. I turned my face forward, toward the Washington Monument piercing the distance like a needle. I didn't cry. I didn't look back again. The adrenaline of that afternoon slowly faded, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of duty, and by the time 3 days had passed, the world had moved on. The crisis was over. The public never knew how close they came to a total blackout. The news channels, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, were all reporting it as a massive solar flare anomaly that caused temporary disruptions. We had scrubbed the logs. The Russian malware was quarantined, analyzed, and neutralized. I sat in my office in the E-ring of the Pentagon. It was a corner office with a view of the Potomac River, though the blinds were drawn halfway to cut the glare. The room was quiet. The only sound was the hum of the secure server rack in the corner and the soft click-clack of my keyboard. I was exhausted. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours in the last 72. My body ached, a deep bone-weary throb that felt strangely satisfying. It was the ache of a job well done. I took a sip of black coffee. It was lukewarm, but it tasted better than any champagne Frank had ever opened. On my dual-monitor setup, the left screen displayed the integrity status of the Eastern Grid, 100% operational. Nobody knew I had saved them. The soccer moms driving their minivans, the stockbrokers on Wall Street, the kids playing video games, none of them knew that General Aisha Moody had stood between them and the Dark Ages. And I was okay with that. True power doesn't need a parade. It doesn't need a medal pinned on a chest at a barbecue. A sudden soft ding broke the silence. A notification slid into the bottom corner of my right monitor. It was an email arriving in my personal Outlook account. I froze. My cursor hovered over the notification. It was from Frank Moody. The subject line read, We need to talk. My heart didn't race this time. There was no adrenaline, just a mild, dull curiosity, like looking at an old scar that doesn't hurt anymore. I clicked open the email. Aisha, I've been trying to call you for 3 days. Your mother is worried sick. We didn't know. I didn't know. Seeing you with those men, seeing that star. It was a lot to take in. I guess I misjudged things. I'm writing this because I think we need to clear the air. You're a general. That's a big deal, kid. That's a hell of an achievement. Come over for dinner this Sunday. I'll grill steaks. Proper steaks this time. We should discuss your career. I have some thoughts on how you can leverage this for a consulting gig later. Love, Dad. I read it twice. I guess I misjudged things. That's a big deal. And the kicker. I have some thoughts on how you can leverage this. Even in his apology, he was trying to be the advisor. Even in his shame, he was trying to take ownership of my success. He didn't apologize for calling me useless. He didn't apologize for the years of neglect. He apologized because he realized he had bet on the wrong horse. He wasn't writing to his daughter. He was writing to a brigadier general. If I were still just Aisha, the IT support girl, if the helicopter had never come, if I had walked away from that party in tears, would this email exist? The answer was a resounding, absolute no. His respect was conditional. It was currency he only spent when he thought he could get a return on investment. I hovered my fingers over the keyboard. The old Aisha, the one who craved his love like a drug, wanted to type back. She wanted to explain. She wanted to say, Dad, I did this for you. Do you love me now? She wanted to scream, go to hell. But the general knew better. There is a quote from Jesus in the Bible, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. For years, I thought forgiveness meant letting people back in. I thought it meant wiping the slate clean and giving them another chance to hurt you. But as I sat there, looking at the Potomac River glittering in the sunlight, I realized I was wrong. Forgiveness isn't for them, it's for me. Forgiving Frank meant accepting him for what he was, a small, limited man who loved his version of reality more than he loved his own child. It meant letting go of the hope that he would ever change. It meant cutting the anchor so I could finally sail. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know he had broken his daughter's heart 1,000 times, and he never would. I didn't type a reply. I didn't type, I forgive you. I didn't type, go to hell. Any response would be fuel. Any response would tell him that he still had access to me, that his words still had the power to make me jump. I moved my mouse to the top ribbon of the Outlook window. I hovered over the little cardboard box icon. Archive. I clicked it. The email vanished from my inbox. No reply sent, no read receipt returned, just silence. The silence of a tomb. The silence of outer space. The silence of a woman who no longer needed to scream to be heard. I closed the browser and turned my chair back to the main monitor, where a new intelligence report was flashing amber, waiting for my authorization. I had a country to defend. I had a team that would take a bullet for me. I had a life that was vast, important, and entirely my own. I didn't have time for people who only loved the uniform, not the woman wearing it. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, recycled air of the Pentagon. It tasted like freedom. Major Vance, I spoke into my comms headset, my voice steady and strong. Let's get to work. If my journey proves anything, it is this profound truth. Your value is never determined by the volume of someone else's applause, not even your parents'. I spent years auditioning for acceptance, begging for validation that was never coming. But I learned that true power isn't about bragging at a backyard barbecue. It is about the quiet confidence of knowing exactly who you are when the lights go out. You don't need to scream to be heard. You just need to be excellent. When you build your life on the concrete foundation of your own self-respect, absolutely no one can tear it down. I define me. Have you ever been treated like a nobody while carrying the heaviest burdens in silence? That crushing disrespect is exactly why we love raw military revenge stories. There is nothing more satisfying than watching an arrogant bully get utterly destroyed by the quietest warrior in the room. This is the ultimate military revenge, where hidden brilliance completely shatters loud ignorance. If you believe every silent elite deserves their absolute moment of absolute vindication, smash that like button and subscribe right now. Drop your thoughts below. Let's build a powerful community that knows its true worth. Until next time, stay sharp.